I wrenched on my car for the first time and almost killed it. So in my last video I talked about how there are a few different problems that the car currently has and how I'm going to try and fix as many of them as I can by myself at my home in my driveway. At the moment I haven't gotten extremely far, but I thought I'd make a little video showing off what I have done so far and how it's affected my mental health. Now first off, before anything else, I had to get the car up on jack stands. This is effectively step 0 of working on a car. And well, I almost had to completely call the whole thing off right there. At first I tried with my low profile trolley jack to jack up the side of the car from the sills, and I ended up bending the frame. And so then I tried with the small scissor jack that came with the car, and that wasn't really strong enough. It didn't really seem to go high enough, and I was very concerned that if it did, it wouldn't really be able to hold the weight of half of the car. So I abandoned that idea as well. And yeah, that was the point where I was like, oh shit, can I actually do this? Yes, I'm just a bit of an idiot. What I can do is jack up each individual corner with the scissor jack. Yes, it takes a bit longer, but it's much easier, much simpler, and much less scary than using the trolley jack. All I have to do is just slide it pretty close to the jacking point, just enough space away so that I can slide the stands underneath, and then yeah, just crank it up. It's pretty easy. It did take a while, but the car was up on the stands. That's what I wanted. The first order of action was to do a power steering flush. Now that probably wasn't the first thing on my list, but I figured I'd do it because it would be the easiest and the car's engine was already warm. So to do a power steering flush, it's actually quite simple. You just get a vacuum pump, you pump out the old fluid from the reservoir, pour in some new fluid, and then you start the car and you turn the steering wheel around a bunch of times to circulate that new fluid. Then, theoretically, after doing that whole process a few times, all the new fluid will have circled throughout all the pipes, and there will be no old fluid left in the system. And I can confirm that on my last pump, yeah, it looked pretty clear, although I did forget to actually show what it looked like. Once that was done, I poured the old fluid into the bottles that the new fluid came in, and effectively just stopped working on the car for a few days. Primarily, I was waiting for a shipment of more parts. They didn't arrive until next week. I did that power steering job on Friday, and then the next Friday, everything arrived. However, they did come from overseas, and considering it was less than 2 weeks, I do have to give them props. That was a pretty quick delivery. Also considering that one of the items wasn't dispatchable until 2 business days after I ordered, so again, it would have actually been a bit sooner if I didn't go with that particular item. So all around, I can say that I'm pretty happy with how quickly that was delivered. Anyway, now that I had those parts, it was time to get on with some of the more complicated stuff. Now just to be clear, the reason I was so confident with all these repairs is because I had a repair manual. That told me stuff like torque specs and procedures, like steps to, take something off. It was just made everything a whole lot easier. So I'd highly recommend that if you are planning to work on your own car, purchase one of those. It's going to straightforward the whole process a lot better, and it might even give you some part numbers for things that you can't find anymore. I started with the rear shock absorbers, since I figured that while it was still a bit complicated, it would be simpler than, for instance, changing the drive shaft. Now I was going to do the shocks on the Friday that all the parts came, however, unfortunately I wasn't going to be able to do that, but what I found out is that I needed a deep socket, and I didn't have one.
Oh.
And by the time I came to this revelation, it was already past 5 PM, which means that all of the hardware stores that might have had a socket were closed. However, I did want to do at least something productive that day, so I decided to change the air filter.
Man filter.
Because I had no idea when it was last changed, and I thought that it was something I could do that day since I've got the part, and I wanted to do it anyway, just to be safe and get a fresh one in there. And that particular job was pretty easy. A few minutes. Really nothing too special. However, even before all the parts got here on Friday, there was actually another job that I had attempted to do, and forgot to record. and that was changing the fuel injectors, because the ones in there at the moment are bad. I'm pretty sure in the original video where I looked over the issues it had, I said that it needed to be remapped. That's not true. The injectors in there are for a smaller engine. Weird that it's running rich rather than running lean, but it does seem to have less top-end power, so perhaps it's running rich at idle and low RPM, and then at the higher RPM, the smaller injectors that don't deliver enough fuel can't get the power up to what it should be, and so it's actually making like maybe 150 horsepower. It feels around there. Like, it should be 167, and it feels like it's got 20 horsepower less. It's not very quick. So, that would be pretty straightforward. Just take out the fuel rail. Obviously, I would have depressurized the fuel system, but at that point the engine was cold, and the last time I had them changed, my friend who helped me didn't depressurize the fuel system, so I figured that I'd just let the fuel dump everywhere, and if it got on anything special, I'd wipe it off. Pretty simple. Unfortunately, the rest of it was not. Taking the fuel rail out was quite easy, albeit very smelly, but then when I took out the last injector, which from the car's perspective was all the way on the left, I noticed that the small rubber seal wasn't on the injector, and that meant it had come off and it was inside the intake manifold. Well, not quite, it was actually in the port for the injectors to go into, so I tried to take it out using some pliers. That didn't work, so I tried with a small screwdriver. That didn't work either, and I pushed it in. And by doing so, I effectively complicated this entire process from what would have been like an hour to a week, mainly because I had to take the intake manifold off. I couldn't really figure out how to do it, and then when I took it off, it was already like 3 or 4 days after I'd started, and I realized I needed a new intake manifold gasket because the one on there was effectively like paper. Not in a good way, like it was a paper gasket. I mean, it was like a felt sort of gasket that had just turned to paper. I'm imagining that that gasket, and by extension the intake manifold, had not been removed for a while. So that was an extra couple days of waiting, but in the meantime, while I waited for that gasket, I did want to try and get that little seal out of the intake manifold. So I invested in a hook and pick set, and it wasn't in the manifold. Yep. That's not good. However, I do want to point out that all the valves looked pretty clean. No real carbon buildup or anything like that, which I think is quite good. It's a sign that the engine is relatively healthy. Of course, this could just be the engine is port injected rather than directly injected, like some more modern engines, but I'd also like to think it's because of me Anyway, the point is, that seal was not in a good place, and I needed to get it out. And that's when it all kind of went to shit. At first I tried with this other tool I'd bought recently, which had like a sort of grabby spring extendo thingy on the end, and that was just too big. It just kept grabbing on the valve stem. But while I was waiting for that hook and pick set to arrive, because of course I was stupid and I didn't just pick it up myself, I got it delivered, and there were delays over the weekend. It was just really annoying. In the meantime, I got to work on the rear shock absorbers, because I had actually secured the correct size deep socket. And it wasn't too bad. Undid the nut on top and the bottom, took out the bolts, slid it off, put the new one in, slid the bolts back in, whatever. There was a problem though. The nuts were nylock nuts, and they're not reusable. I had to get new nylock nuts. Now, in order to get the nylock nuts, I first had to figure out what thread they were. Thankfully, the repair manual had me covered. It gave me some part numbers for the nuts, but they didn't really lead anywhere. However, it did also have the measurements for the threads. So I used those, got some equivalents. Once I got here, I torqued down the smaller ones at the top of the shock absorber to 70 Newton meters, which is what it said in the repair manual, and then again what it said in the repair manual, the bottom ones I torqued down to 96 Newton meters. With all that done, the hook and pick set was here. So, back to the intake. After a bunch of fiddling, I was not really any closer, and after a bit more fiddling, I pushed the seal into the cylinder. At least, that's what I thought I did. I decided then and there that I wanted to invest in a bore scope, and thankfully I managed to pick one up that had pretty decent reviews for a good price. My plan was instead of taking the entire engine apart, which would have been incredibly annoying and tedious, I would instead try and pick it up through the spark plug hole. Now, the problem is the fourth cylinder, or the cylinder all the way on the left from the car's perspective, I thought it would be lower down and harder to reach with the hook and pick set because the intake valves were of course slightly open. Thankfully, as I looked in with the bore scope, it seemed to actually be the opposite. It was quite high and the intake valves were actually closing. Also, quick side note, after taking out the spark plug, I did show it to the camera, and as you can see, it's pretty black. That tells us that, well, there's been too much fuel. You know, it's covered in soot, which makes sense given that that's what was happening for the past like 7 months. Good thing I've got replacements. Now, using the bore scope, I had a look around the cylinder, tried to find that little seal, and interestingly, it wasn't there. So this is all I'm really seeing. That's the piston there. I know that. Just don't know where exactly the pulled it out of the spark plug. You get the idea anyway. Well, where could it have gone then? I definitely didn't want to start the engine without finding it, because even though it's very, very small, that little bit of rubber, it would break up inside the cylinder and it would cause a lot of problems. Hell, if it was like jammed in the valve, it could even completely stop it from moving, and that could ruin the top end. It could do so many horrible things. Wait a second. Jammed in the valve? Where I can't see it? It might be there. So, I took the bore scope and I put it in the intake. Sure enough, it was jammed right in there. Now, I don't have a photo of this because I'm a bit of an idiot and I didn't show it, but if you imagine this is the valve, you know, slightly open, this is the port that it opens up, and then the little seal was right here, jammed right there, in between the valve and the wall. Now that's a problem because I wouldn't be able to see it, or at least not without that bore scope. And I didn't really realize that I could have both the bore scope and the pick in the intake hole at the same time until like about an hour of trying to get it, because I'm a bit of an idiot. But eventually I figured that out. So I put in the bore scope and I tried to pick out that little seal while looking through the camera. Now, of course, there was no pressure riding on my shoulders at all. If I pushed the seal into the cylinder, that would only mean an extra week or so of work and waiting for more parts. Nothing major.
This is like doing surgery. Except I'm not a trained professional. Here we go.